Hello and welcome to today's Contourl webinar, Budgeting for Information Governance. First, for some housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded. This recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow. At the end of today's presentation, we'll show a list of upcoming complimentary webinars. If you or any colleagues are interested in joining future sessions, please visit us at contourl.com and select the Events tab to register. We'll also share white papers, blog posts, and articles we've recently published. We invite you to complete our brief post-event survey. We truly value and appreciate your feedback. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at info@contourl.com. And now allow me to introduce today's speakers, Tom Mild, Chief Operating Officer of Contourl, and Mark Diamond, Contourl President and CEO.
Thank you very much. Tom, welcome today. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
And I'm Mark Diamond, CEO of Contourl. I think a lot of you know us. And just a reminder, we are going to talk about products and technologies today, but we're an independent provider. We do not sell or resell or take any referral fees on any products, any e-discovery. We don't store any paper documents. And so the opinions you hear on the technologies are exactly that. We work with quite a few organizations and are witness to the success or failure of many of these technologies, and we're just going to share our experiences, and we're not motivated for any particular financial reason. All right, so welcome. We're going to dive into and focus today on how do you budget for information governance or records management, but to do so really opens some key questions, which is, okay, when we want to budget, what are we budgeting for? What's the scope of what we're looking to do? And once we understand that, what are some of the pieces that are going to be involved in that? And do those pieces vary? We'll talk a little bit about need to purchase technology. If you have, for example, a records program that you want to modernize, or you have an information governance program, or you want to do document or data disposition, do you need to buy tools to do that effectively? How do many organizations, when they first approach this feels like a fairly overwhelming process. Can we divide it into phases? What goes, is it all going this year, or it goes into subsequent years? What if this is one time? We don't pay for once. What's a recurring costs? Hey, if we're going to start information governance or upgrade, do we need to hire people? Do we need to hire more people? What kind of people should we hire? I know I'm going to be asked this question. Many of you are saying to yourselves, if we do ask for a budget, senior management may come back and say, what's the ROI on this? If we spend it, what can we expect in terms of cost savings or return on investment? Who should pay for it? If you're just the legal or the records or the compliance group or the IT group, should other groups pay for it? What sort of typical? And then finally, there's these pieces of information governance. Does everybody do everything, or are there certain pieces that different companies or other organizations tend to do or not do? And so we're going to cover all of these issues. And the reason we're raising these issues up front is we think in order to accurately address what you need to budget, we sort of have to work through these issues. Otherwise, we don't really quite know what we're budgeting for. And so let's jump on the first question. Tom, take us through. What are we going to do?
Well, the first thing you really want to look at is what the scope of your program needs to be. What are you trying to tackle? And this is, in some ways, maybe not the easiest part of this, but the most straightforward. If you are just attacking records management, if you are just building a records program at the organization, in your organization, which is making sure that we are keeping the right records for the right amount of time, and that we have ways to dispose of that information, that's largely what your records program entails. That's the scope, and that's what you're budgeting for. However, a lot of organizations, when they think about information governance, need to think about all the different pieces of this. Now, parts of these pieces may already be managed in some part by there may be parts of this program that are already engaged or in place at your organization. Privacy, it may already be there. Your litigation team may already be working on litigation readiness and e-discovery. Certainly, information security is going to be a process and a function that already exists. But part of this, you see, records management is just one small piece of the information governance pie. You want to make sure, what are we actually scoping for? It may be that you just have a records program that you're scoping for, or you really do want to establish an information governance program. What kind of budget do we need to establish to fill in the blanks of the pieces that might be missing from this diagram that you see, assuming that you already have things like this? What are the pieces that are missing, and how do we budget for those?
Now, Tom, sometimes organizations start out down the path saying, hey, I just want to get started, so let's just tackle records management. How well can you do records management as a solo activity, or to what extent does records management begin to need to be coordinated with, or potentially interfere with some of these other compliance initiatives?
Well, so there's two different things we need to think about here. One is, how do they intersect versus do they all need to be governed at the level of an information governance organization? And I think the short answer is that you can stand up a records program with the understanding that you will need to interact with most of the other items on that information governance area. You will, to make sure that you're maintaining records right, you have to have a handle on your legal holds. So you got to deal with your litigation and your e-discovery team to make sure that you are keeping personal information the right amount of time. You have to interact and engage with the privacy team. Do you need to have a full-fledged information governance program to do all of that? You don't. It's probably a best practice. It's probably where you want to aim for. But if starting and with a piece of this and saying, I'm going to stand up a records program, that's perfectly acceptable and probably a good thing to not let perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's make small get with what we can actually accomplish now with the idea that we're moving towards more. Just understand that you're going to have to interact with some of these other regimes or functions within your organization in order to be successful at the records management piece.
And if you ask information governance professionals, this image on the right oftentimes look correct. And information governance professionals will tell you, yeah, information governance is, the higher level up discipline. And all these others are sort of orbiting around the sun of information governance. And if you talk to privacy people, they may have a different opinion. If you talk to traditional data governance people, they may have a different opinion. Or you talk about the AI folks, they may say, no, information governance is a subset of that. We're not really, we want to be careful. Yes, all of those are correct. And as opposed to saying, hey, I'm on, I'm king or queen of the compliance mountain. Let's just talk about what they do and how we can work together versus trying to do that. And oftentimes these budget discussions sort of turn into ascendancy real estate wars, and we don't think that that's very productive. So let's talk about the different key program components within information. Tom, walk us through this, and this may be a larger list, but when we think about either doing records management or information governance, what are some of the things that organizations do?
Well, what you're thinking about in records management is primarily keeping the right information the right amount of time, which is making sure that you have a policy and schedule in place. You have the right procedures in order to tell people, not only tell people how to retain information, but how to run your department. How long do we keep the data of departing employees? What do we do if we acquire a company or we divest of a part of our business? What do we do there? It's having the right training and change management to let people know that this is a little bit different than keeping everything forever, keeping them with good retention behaviors. This is about legacy document and data disposition. I would make the argument that some of the stuff over to the right there, that unstructured data placement and automation strategy, really belongs in part of the records management piece too, because that's part of that disposition of information. You want to make sure that you're not only keeping what you need to keep for the right period of time, but being able to dispose of it when it's time to dispose of. You want to make sure that you're able to do that at the same time. You want to be able to audit your program. You want to be able to audit your schedule. You want to be able to update things. That's really the components of a standard records management program. When you are looking more at the information governance program, what we add in there is a data security classification policy, making sure that your information security is managing information by its sensitivity label, in addition to its retention requirement. You want to make sure that you have a good discovery response process, and the litigation readiness is not capturing a lot of non-record information that doesn't need to be captured in irrelevant information in litigation or investigations or regulatory matters. You want to privacy enable your program, and not just privacy enable your program, you want a privacy program to the extent that that you have responsibility over privacy or not. You want to make sure that management and correct appropriate treatment of personal information is covered the right way. And we've been talking a lot in webinars about AI, making sure that the quality of your AI information, the information that's being fed, I guess, or read to AI, has good quality. That sort of has a little bit of a hand in many of these here. If you're not disposing of the right information, your AI data quality will tend to suffer. So down near the bottom, everything tends to be a little bit the same as records management. With information governance, you're adding some of those extra components in that we saw around that diagram that aren't part of a traditional records management program.
And again, this is not a complete list out there, but this is some of the pieces that we seem to be. Now, some of you may be saying, hey, this feels a little bit overwhelming. Is this all the stuff? What order we do this stuff, and what is what we see? And again, what we're laying today is our experiences working with literally hundreds of companies, having them go through the process. Your company, of course, can be different, or your organization may attack this differently. But Tom, talk to us a little bit about what we see as somewhat typical in terms of what they do in what order and how long those different pieces take.
So I think the one takeaway for this slide and the next slide that we're going to talk about is there's not an easy button for this. And from a budgeting standpoint, that actually may be a good thing. You can start to spread your budget out over multiple years and not ask for everything to be all in 1 year, which makes it a little bit more palatable to be able to do that. Here's how we usually see this working out. And this is really for an organization that really either doesn't have a program or really isn't sure that its program is successful. Because first, what you want to do is figure out, where are we? What is our maturity level right now? And develop a roadmap to improve that maturity. That roadmap is going to define your budget over the next X number of years. That's really where it starts. So once you've got that roadmap in place, you can then say, here's how much we expect to spend this year, next year, the following year, and as far out as you need to implement the program. We usually find in that first 2 to 6 months, once you've developed and understand your maturity, you're developing the foundation. You're creating the schedule and the policy. You're developing any associated procedures and processes that go along with that. You're making sure that you have an organizational structure in place to be able to support it that you're moving forward. Those are the foundational things that we see most organizations doing right out of the bat. Right off the bat, they're doing that first. When we get into, and it says 3 to 18 months, it could even be longer. Some organizations want to go longer to so-called implement your records program. And what we usually see in this column is, how do you enforce your retention schedule across the organization? That is making sure that you have the right strategy against your unstructured data. You have the right strategies for the different types of systems that you keep, where you keep structured information, databases, systems, applications. You want to make sure paper is down near the bottom of that list, but for those of you who are still dealing with paper storage, you want to make sure that you have a plan for either getting rid of the paper that can be gotten rid of, or finding a way to scan or pay for long-term retention of the paper that needs to be kept for a very long period of time. It includes training. And training is something that goes on throughout all of this. It's not just a one and done type thing, because you're going to be training people on different aspects of an information governance program as it goes along. You'll want to conduct some pilots and then have a general rollout of your program. And we've seen some companies do that in a year. We've seen some companies take 2 to 3 years to do it. We've seen some who I would say are less successful take even longer than that, but that's a topic for a different webinar. Where you think about ongoing budgeting, you're really thinking about maintenance and maintenance of the program, making sure that the coordinators and the people who are part of your organizational structure are well trained and well equipped to go out and talk to the business about good information governance practices. You want to make sure that you're updating any of the implementation that you have to the extent that you've rolled things out appropriately. Making sure that you're updating. We are seeing that tools are improving all the time in how they can automate disposition. You'll want to be evolving with the times and making sure that your technology can update that and be updated as well. There should be a support for the program, whether that's a help desk or some other venue that you have to help support the business who records management or information governance is not their day job. You will want to set up a regular audit process. We talk about this so much during our webinars. If you are not finding a way to figure out how did we do this, how did we do what we said we were going to do, and if so, how did we do it, then you're not going to be successful, or you'll never know whether you're going to be successful. And then performing the required updates, anything that you absolutely need as part of updating the program isn't ongoing. So those are the three different kind of columns and buckets that you're going to want to think about. The short-term budget, the longer-term budget, and the ongoing maintenance budget are the three main things you need to be thinking about.
All right, Tom, so those are some of the general things we need to do. How do we know what we specifically want to do and what I should budget for this year or next year?
Well, this is where your roadmap comes in. So hopefully at the very beginning of that process, you have identified, here are the things we need to do. Here's where we're lacking. A lot of times that means having an assessment and understanding what your maturity level is. Even if it doesn't, even if you just say, we know what we need to do, put it on paper. Put out a roadmap. Here are the things that we need to do, and here's how long it's going to take, and be realistic about this. Say, this is, conservatively, this is what we think we can do. And that's going to drive what your budget is. You're going to be able to then look and say, all right, these are the 4 things that need to happen this year. Here's how much each one of those is going to cost to implement. You then will have a better chance of being more accurate in everything, but you've got to be accurate in and realistic in putting this roadmap together. If you're a slow organization to get things done, and there are those, and that's okay, make sure that you don't do something that's too aggressive. By the same token, don't ask for a shorter budget because you plan to be slow, and then you end up going faster and run out of money and don't have the money to do it. So really be realistic about how long you think you need to do it. And we usually see organizations kind of err on the side of being more deliberate than trying to be aggressive in getting it done, because when you're rolling it out to an organization, this is not any of their day job. This is something that they are not going to really want to do. They're going to have to learn the change management aspects of it, and you're going to have to fit it in around the job that they are already doing. So a deliberate, realistic roadmap will always be a better on the budget than a quick, aggressive, potentially expensive budget that ends things faster and usually is less successful.
Well, and I guess the other thing we want to add is make sure that we're inclusive on this, because the biggest mistake you can make is budgeting is get your budget. You go through it and you go, oh, by the way, we realize N quarters later that we need to also do this and do this. And senior management, that's not a popular move. Better to show the big picture up front and saying, okay, we're going to divide this versus, and we may not do all these things, that's fine. Versus coming up with the half-year surprise, which again, that's never, from those that approve the budgets, that's never a real popular way of doing that. Now, one of the questions you may get is how are we going to save money on this? If we're going to spend money, obviously these days there's a lot of focus on cost reduction within organizations. How does this help us save money? And can we come up with a hard ROI? I've done webinars in the past. I remember there was one state agency that hired a consultant, and the consultant came up with a figure of saying, if you do this, you'll save $13,371,222. It was like this really very specific amount, which is incorrect, because you cannot break the ROI down that simply. or if you do provide that, you're not going to be very credible. We find in general, there's 4 different types of ROI on this. There's the hard ROI. If you're a save everything forever organization and we can get a good records program or a larger information governance program, and we can delete a lot of our electronic information, and really, we'll talk about this, if you can cut down in your paper storage, clear out, the Iron Mountain facilities full of your stuff, or other vendors out there, actually there's some saving on that. I think the paper remediation is one of the best ROIs out there. And you can estimate that, but that's not the only one. Sometimes one of the biggest expenses of having over retention of information, as many organizations are wont to do, is increase e-discovery cost. And maybe you've been through this. We were through a large litigation. We had to hire an e-discovery vendor. We spent millions of dollars reviewing documents we should have never had in the first place. And that not only added costs, it added risk, other things like that. We think that's a very good ROI, except we don't know if it's going to be applicable. If who knows whether next year or the year after that, if we're going to have large litigation, and sometimes you have a feeling. Sometimes there's regulatory sweeps happening, but a lot of times you don't. And so I would be careful presenting that to senior management to say, hey, if we do this, we're going to save this money. If we do this and we have large amount of litigation, we can save a lot of money. If we don't have as much litigation, or if we have less than normal litigation, then we're not going to save as much money. Just be honest about that and present it as a variable picture. There's also, risks out there. You could end up with fines, not only in terms of records retention, which we've seen. Obviously, we're seeing much more activity in terms of the privacy regulators, both in Europe and the US and other geographies, ramping up on fines around that area, industry-specific fines out there. And so, but again, if there's a regulatory sweep, we have to pay fines. Boy, we'll be glad that we cleaned up our records or tightened up our records or more compliant on that. But if those don't happen, then we don't. So that's sort of a dependent ROI. And one of the best ROIs is employee productivity. And I'm going to throw on AI readiness on this. If we can get better management of our data, we can both save the amount of time it takes employees to look for stuff, and we're going to be able to better use. I'm speaking a little bit quickly here. Let me slow down. We will be able to better use our information, higher data quality, to make employees more productive. That's a huge ROI. Now, the problem is that that's a little squishy. How do you know that exactly how much? Because the productivity increases vary tremendously from employee to employee and business unit to business unit. We oftentimes will do a high level estimate. We'll say, hey, this is a high level estimate. This is what we're doing. And so don't be afraid of presenting an ROI, but also be honest about it. And in our experience, senior management knows this. And so the more honest you are, actually, we think the more credibility you'll get in terms of your budget request out there. All right, we want to talk about now just some key components that we see out there. We've talked about these in other webinars, so we're not going to dwell on this a long time, but we want to highlight them about when you're budgeting. So one of the things a lot of organizations budget for is updating their records retention schedule. Why do they budget that, and how big of a task is that, Tom?
So I think that, I think the first thing, this is one area in which if you are getting a schedule that is a more modern, easier to implement schedule, you save money down the road. You can budget in a different way. We are working with right now organizations whose schedules are actively working against implementation that make it very, very difficult to do what we're doing. So the approach, like Mark said, we won't spend a lot of time. We talk about this in all of the organization, all of our webinars. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to have everything in it, both the records that are typical to the company and that are company specific. It needs to have records that have requirements that are both legal and regulatory, but also records that have business value. You can't just be, that comes under the heading of all records, everything that you have. We want to make sure also that it includes some accounting for how we deal with personal information and what is the legitimate business need for the retention period that we have for it. You want to make sure, and this makes your AI deployments much easier, is making sure that your policies and your schedules make it better, that you will have better information for your AI tools to use. I think that it just really comes down to the fact that you get to a schedule that is more capable of being implemented easily, and your implementation immediately eases up and is much more straightforward. Still might take a while, still might deal with people, but the actual friction required to get all of that done will be so much easier than if your schedule is long, complicated, or not capable of being implemented, especially by IT.
Now, Tom, but creating a schedule itself doesn't save money, correct?
The schedule itself doesn't save the money. No, it's not.
And if I have a schedule, it doesn't start deleting stuff. What do you say to organizations that say, well, we kind of got a schedule, let's just move on because we want to get in the deletion phase?
Well, it depends on what your schedule is like. We worked with a company recently who said, our schedule is very robust. We've had it vetted and we're very proud of the schedule. And we took a look at it and found about 10 things that would make it difficult. I showed it to our technical team and they said, there's no way we can implement this. We just can't do it. And so we had to talk with them and say, here are the problems you are going to have, and specifically detailed that you will not be able to, one of our goals and the things we talked about also in the webinar is let's enable as much automatic disposition as possible. To the extent that we can, let's automate that as much as possible. And the way to do that is to have a schedule whose retention periods allow for that automated disposition. And when your schedule isn't friendly to that, then your disposition is going to be hard. It's going to be difficult or impossible. So I think that if you say we've got a schedule and it's good enough, you need to make sure. You need to be confident that it's good enough.
And in some cases we do find schedules are good enough and we say, that's great, let's move on. There's lots of stuff to do, but I think this is an important piece of it out here. All right, and talk us through, this is something a lot of organizations, when you're talking about a records program, just what are processes and procedures, what do they look at, and why might you want to budget for this?
Well, part of the thing that we see in lots of organizations is that they have a policy and a schedule, which are the what and the how long, but there's not enough of the how. Which one, teach your employees how to actually do things, how to make sure that they're keeping information, but two, how your records program should also be run. And I mentioned them earlier, some of the things that I think are really important these days, they're not included on this particular slide, but they're things like, how do we deal with departing employee data? When an employee leaves, is it just left there? IT is going to disable their email and their OneDrive probably, but what about records that they created out there on the file shares or in SharePoint somewhere? Is someone taking ownership of that? What happens to their information? We go into organizations and see a lot of places where they're just folders named Dave or Mary, and those are people who are long gone. What if you have an organization that likes to, that is very prone to acquiring or other companies, or you have to divest a company? What happens to the integration of that information or de-integration if you are divesting of something? How do you make sure that the acquired entities' records are managed the same way that you're managing your records? These are just two examples, but there are ways that a lot of organizations aren't doing right now to make sure that you're running a very smooth, straightforward records management program, and you're thinking about records in all aspects of how they're managed throughout your organization.
So let's move on and get a little more brass tacks about funding. One of the questions we have quite often is, do we need to purchase a document management system? And should that be something we sort of do from day one? And our answer, well, actually, let me take a step back. There's three types of technology that may be relevant to information governance. One is management of unstructured data. This includes things like Microsoft or 365 or Google Docs, or maybe you have a more traditional enterprise content management like OpenText or OnBase, and there's a wide variety there. So it's a very specific, like Viva for life sciences out there. There are some structured data tools out there if you want to attack database data. Calibra and Informatica are two of the larger ones. And then there's this whole area of content analytics. M365 has the more expensive E5 version of trainable classifiers. There's DLP products, data loss prevention products like Varonis and OneTrust and BigID. Okay, do we need to buy all of these? Well, I want to be careful telling you in this webinar what you do or don't need, but let me relay the experiences that we have with a lot of our organizations. Nearly all of our clients find that the technology that they own today is sufficient, at least for getting a long way on the world of information governance. If you have Microsoft 365, for example, nearly all of your peers in your industry that have been this are using Microsoft 365 to very effectively, compliantly, defensively store emails and files. They're not upgrading to a more expensive, real system. Now, if we were talking 7 years ago, I would say, boy, SharePoint, that probably doesn't cut it. But these days, M365, Teams, SharePoint Online, other ones like that, actually pretty darn robust technologies. You still may have a need for an OpenText, or maybe you have legacy OpenText. The structured data isn't the tools on that. Some of these tools are out there, but they tend to be more for projects around traditional data governance and master data management and less around information governance. And then finally, if you have something like a DLP system like Varonis, and we've talked about that, those tools are very good about finding very specific types of data, oftentimes personal info data that has a regular expression. If we want to find, a certain type of documents, but as the be-all, end-all of finding all records out there, we have not found them as successful. And we've got some columns on this and some articles on this. So what this means, we've had companies come up to us and say, at this point, should we put in the 2027 budget money for buying tools? And our response is probably not. Or if you do, you may not do in 2027. It'd be something in 2028 and 29. But the vast majority of companies go all the way or nearly all the way without having to buy any new tools or more software, which makes us Control somewhat unpopular with some of the product vendors who want us to. I get calls the whole week long. Hey, Mark, why don't you pitch our product, or why don't you do this? And I'm like, sorry, that's not our gig. I mean, if we think what you have is very valuable, we'll be the first one to say this is great. But a lot of times, and even in Microsoft, you can use the E3 version of Microsoft. Just a few people may want to have the more expensive E5 or now the E7 version to be able to do that, which again makes us less popular with the folks at Microsoft sometimes. But no, you can go an awful long way. So I wouldn't necessarily have buying new technology a large component of your budgeting process, which is also, by the way, going to the IT folks saying, hey, we're going to use what we already have. That's often a message that will strongly resonate with the IT team and get them to be able to participate. So be clear about that. All right. By the way, we're going through all these pieces, then we're going to tie these pieces together as we get to the tail end of this. Do we need to hire for people? And who do we need to hire? And we're going to sort of break that into two pieces. So there's sort of, if you hire people for a records management program or information governance program, and we've done a webinar on this, there's sort of 5 skill sets that we think are important. Somebody that has records management capability, somebody that knows something about e-discovery, somebody that knows about privacy. Obviously, how we use technology. Maybe they know how Microsoft M365 is used, or one of these other tools that I just talked about. That's actually a really good thing to have. Probably the most important thing is having organizational awareness, or somebody's an ambassador, somebody who knows how to reach out to the different business units, that's an evangelist for the program, that says, this is why we want to do it and get everybody on board. That's a really good skill. You are unlikely to find an individual that has all of these skills. And if you do, that person is probably fairly expensive. Likewise, what we've seen a lot of times is organizations will promote internally, or hire somebody that has some of these skills, but is a good athlete that can learn all of those. And so that's important. But there's a more fundamental question I want that I think that needs to be asked, which is, who do we hire and when do we hire? Do we have to hire and budget for a program builder or a program maintainer? If you hire somebody that can build your program, if you have a permanent staff position, these individuals like building records program, and they like to sit on the bit of the cutting edge. However, unlikely the candidate has all the skills needed. Builders are much more expensive. And to be honest, a lot of times they lack patience when faced with the slower organizational pace, and they can get bored once program is complete and often have limited tenure. Therefore, a lot of organizations we work with, and I'll say we somewhat self-serving, but despite it being self-serving, it's very, very true. Most organizations that take a deep look at this, instead of hiring a program builder, they will hire an outside consultant like Contoro to help them do the one-time build of the program. And then they'll hire a program maintainer, somebody that prefers managing over building. They cost less. They're easier to find somebody, often internally. They like doing training. They like doing the evangelism. Again, you still need to hire somebody to do the building, but we have seen quite a few organizations being very successful with hiring a maintainer. And the other thing is that you don't necessarily have to hire or move somebody in that role in year one. A lot of times you can do that at the tail end of the building. So from a budgeting perspective, don't feel like, well, we can't start until we hire this program maintainer. We have not found that to be the case. And so you can save money there from a budgeting perspective. We got a question here. It says, we have paper records in storage with lack of clear description of what's in storage. We don't know what's in these items without recalling them from storage, which costs money. How does the cost keeping of documents compare with cost of retrieval? Mark, thank you for submitting that. I'm going to talk about that in a few slides. But my short answer is attack offsite paper storage. Lots of money you can save. The vendors make it difficult to go and tackle it, but that's a great way to save money. And actually, that's oftentimes a very good skill for the program maintainer, is to go attack the offsite record storage. But I'll talk about that in a few slides. But thank you for offering that question. Favorite question, who pays for this? This is something that legal pays for. Is it something that compliance or privacy or risk pays for? A lot of times we'll have legal say, yeah, most of our information is electronic. Doesn't that mean IT has to pay for it? Or, hey, shouldn't the business units own this? Isn't this something we should pay for? So we're probably going to make everybody unhappy with this answer, but it is uncommon for one group to pay for everything. What is more common is they put together a steering committee, and either they parcel out, maybe legal pays for the policy and schedule, maybe IT pays for some of the electronic, what we call the data placement, the electronic management of information, maybe facility pays for the getting rid of that. That's one way. Or sometimes we see this a lot. Well, they'll go where the group will form a steering committee of all these different players, and they'll go to management, and management will approve a special budget, a cross-functional budget, not a part of anybody's department. So we're not taking away legal's budget. And we're funding this as a separate initiative. And that's actually pretty common too. If you find yourself saying, who should pay for this from a budgeting perspective, engage with other stakeholders saying, listen, I'm not pulling you in just so I can foist this cost on you, but I do want you to be involved. And I think we all have a win to be able to do this. And versus if you just sort of throw it over the transom and you expect IT to pay for it, that's a real good, without their buy-in, that's a real way to get initiatives stuck and never getting out of first gear, or actually more typically stuck in parking. Okay, let's talk about some of the cost savings. And we had that good question on paper records management. We have found that a lot of organizations have records sometimes on site, which can be very expensive, but a lot of times off site, either in their own warehouse, or they hire an off-site records vendor. We find a tremendous amount of excess over retained paper documents. We've never tracked that stuff. We don't have paper boxes out there. We don't have processes. We don't know what's out there, and we're paying storage fees. And the vendors have made it an art of making it very easy to put stuff in, but very expensive and difficult to get stuff out, including doing something called hostage fees. Well, if you got to get rid of the box, you got to pay us all this money to get rid of the box. And sometimes they make it so expensive to get rid of stuff, it's just easier on a month-by-month basis to keep on paying the Iron Mountain bill. But then that gets expensive over the long term. So we recommend doing an offsite record storage project. Once you have an up-to-date schedule, let's have a repeatable process that allows us to go through these boxes. Let's delete stuff. Let's go renegotiate our contracts with these vendors. And there's some strategies. We've talked about these in previous webinars. There's some really good strategies you can do to try and do that. But this is probably one of the easier ROIs out there. And it's the vendor sort of assumes we're going to be sort of fat, dumb, and happy. Excuse me for being so blunt, but this is a good way to save a lot of money out there. We need a good schedule. We need a defensible process. And as I mentioned, this is a good way for the ongoing records manager or even cheaper labor to be able to do this. You'll talk to vendors that say you have to have a data map. You have to map all of your documents before you start a records retention schedule. And we've got this technology that allows you to map all your data, all your files. No, I mean, yes, you want to do data mapping for a personal data inventory. We want to do an information types inventory. We want to know what type of content we had. Sometimes you have to do some limited mapping if you're doing a legal hold, but buying a product to do an enterprise-wide unstructured data map, no. And the problem is these products don't really capture enterprise data. They capture some of the data, but they certainly aren't enterprise data. They don't tell you, they'll tell you, you got a file here, but they don't have to tell you who created the file or whether it's a record or not, or very limited ability to be able to do that. And sometimes you say, well, we'll just build our own data map. Well, that quickly becomes out of date. And so again, we want to know what types of information we have, but starting out doing an enterprise-wide data map, no, it's a waste of time and a waste of money. We don't think that's something you need to budget for. There's better ways to be able to spend your money. Okay, another cost saving is, hey, we've got a privacy program that likes to identify personal information and classify and secure it and sometimes delete it. Sometimes delete it by subject access request, or sometimes delete it at the end of its useful period. We do the same thing in records management. Sometimes we can put work streams together. Hey, let's have the privacy folks with the records management folks. Let's have the records management folks work with the e-discovery folks. There's all these common work streams where we can work together. And what we're saying is, as opposed to doing this twice, once with each group, let's do it once with a single group. That can save an awful lot of money. And you've heard us evangelize this, work with your peers, reach out to other groups, find out some common synergies. And so when you're budgeting, we're going to be doing this working together. Huge budgeting issue for organizations. We've talked about this, a way to save money. Don't rent your schedule. We're just not crazy about these rented schedules. Yes, you can get them really quickly. There's one vendor that says you can create your record schedule in minutes. Well, the problem is you're every month you're going to be paying. If you have these vendors that will come up, Filers Keepers or Access Sciences or other ones like this will have, hey, we have this product that will create your schedule for you. The problem is you're paying subscription fees every single month for that. If you get the schedule, to be blunt, we find the quality of these in some cases really lacking. I mean, we find some big mistakes in there, and you got to go validate them. So they're not really saving you a lot of time. They're more difficult to automate. They're not customized. And again, if they work, we'd be the first one to say, hey, do it. We see a lot of organizations owning their own schedule. So when you're budgeting, think about owning your own schedule. You may want to bring in somebody like us, to build your schedule, but when you own it, it's easier to automate, integrate, follow. It's less expensive, and yes, it is more expensive to develop than we can do it in minutes, but it tends to save a lot of money, and it's a cornerstone of what we do, and also helps out with other groups. So we ran a company that was spending like $225,000 a year for their schedule. It's great, crazy amount. And they didn't start that; it sort of crept up in time. No, we want to be smart about that. Another thing is, well, we know at some point we're going to have a staffing member. Do you need a staffing member? We're going to argue that you may want to have a fractional resource on there. Maybe somebody who's 25 or 50 or 75% of the time, maybe a records management or an information governance professional. If somebody does privacy, you very, very well may not need a full-time body. It's sometimes cheaper to do that, or maybe you need it on a short-time basis. If you get a good one, and we offer these, you can get somebody fully trained and ready to engage. And again, you're not burning a headcount for this. And at some point, if you want to bring somebody on board, you can just say, hey, we're gonna stop doing this, which is easy. And then equally important, good resources, and this is the way we work at Contoro. If we have a fractional records manager or fractional information governance professional, that person has the ability to network back into the Contoro team, our entire team. And so you're getting a tremendous amount of expertise with that individual. And then finally, employee coordinators within the business units. Don't necessarily hire a large records management team. Sometimes you can nominate individual coordinators who work in the business units, and we're not adding staff to that. We're taking somebody's existing job and giving them a little bit of extra training, and those people will be sort of super users as subject matter experts to that business units that will work with them to provide advice, to help them out. This is a really good model, and it's a very good way of being able to staff it. So again, if you're thinking about, we need to budget all these, first of all, you don't necessarily need to budget, or if you're hiring a manager, you don't need to budget that right away. Sometimes year 2 or year 3. Maybe you have a manager, you don't have to hire a lot of them. Sometimes you're going to have coordinators on there. Maybe you can do a fractional person. There's all these budgeting things that we've seen organizations do that make a lot of sense. All right, I'm going quickly here. Let's get really down to the details on the costs and resources when budgeting. And we're going to break the costs into CapEx and OpEx. And CapEx is something you can amortize over a period of time. And then we're also going to break it down in the types of resources, because this is sometimes not considered, but I think when you're talking about budgeting, you have to talk about resources. Is it a one-time consulting fee? Are you leveraging your existing legal or IT staff to be able to do this, which you may not have to budget new money for, but it's taking, it's consuming a paid for resource. Do you want to hire somebody new? Or, as I just alluded to, do you want to hire a fractional resource? All right, Tom, what do you see typically what organizations do for, and we have on the left here that some of the tasks that Tom talked about, whether it's doing assessment or a roadmap, or updating your policy and schedule, or creating processes, or updating legal hold. How do organizations typically approach this? And again, there's some differences in there, and so we're being a little bit general here, but what do you see?
Right. So on most of these slides, you're not going to see much in terms of new technology acquisition. Like Mark mentioned before, we very much prefer that you use technology that you already have rather than buy it. So you're not going to see much in that column and what we're talking about, and for what we typically see. What for planning and policy development, for establishing that foundation of a program, what you usually see is that a consultant is coming in at the front end to to assess the situation, make a determination of what's needed, with collaboration by an internal resource, by a core team, if there's already an existing person who's managing the program with them, but if there's no program, with a core team from the groups that Mark was talking about, reaching consensus, having recommendations by consulting, and then reaching consensus on what that roadmap needs to be. From there on down, that becomes more of these become more things that get managed more often by internal and less often by external, where there will be initial creation of some documentation, particularly when organizations have never created them before, or you're working with people who've been promoted from within, or you don't have an organization at all. You're using one-time consulting. It's better to have a subject matter expert prepare that and then turn it over to you that once you're ready to have a manager come in and manage it. Some organizations though take that over. So occasionally we start to see some organizations do that on that side. So that's, I think that'll be the theme on these three slides here is
Sorry, that was me.
Oops, you're going the
I'm going
opposite
down.
direction.
How about the next area? And again, we're giving you a high level one.
Yeah, so when it comes to developing a program and executing the program, this is mostly about implementation. There may be some technology purchase when you talk about implementation, whether that is for unstructured or structured information. I'd probably put that rarely at structured into sometimes because structured information is so challenging. But it follows a similar pattern here, is that having an outside consultant help to develop the strategy, help to develop the process that you then take on and manage from there. For you, what you'll notice near the bottom is the strategy gets developed externally and then implemented internally. The training gets developed externally and then delivered internally. The paper processes get developed externally and then delivered internally. That's the usual, and that usually ends up being the more cost-effective way of dealing with it, is to have someone internally execute, but have the initial documentation developed by the subject matter expert from an external source. And then when we look at monitoring, that becomes much more often the internal resource doing that doing that work. The training, the help desk. Occasionally, we will see, frankly, when it's time for a refresh, we get asked a lot of times to say, take a look at our policy and schedule and refresh it. Tell us if there have been any changes to the law. So those are things that come back to an outside consultant. But most of the activities in this management and maintenance really should be done internally, either by an internal resource or a fractional resource, because they need to, because you have the best visibility to do it.
So going back a little bit, when we're making these recommendations, we're not saying that, hey, you could never do any of these things internally. You have to hire an outside consultant. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying now, having seen literally hundreds of companies do this, our feeling of what works best, what ends up being most efficient and most effective, what drives the program forward, is generally these: either having a consultant, doing by an internal resource, hiring a staffing person. And notice on the technology, we really don't see a lot of organizations for information governance program really have to buy a lot of technology. Sometimes it happens, but not that much. And so this is the patterns that we're seeing from organizations that do it fairly successfully out there. And you don't have to decide this right away. A lot of times organizations will start out with an assessment and roadmap. They're going to figure out, hey, is this part of it already good? Hey, do we already have a good policy and schedule? Do we have a good data security classification policy, for example? A lot of times we find a really good data security classification policy. We don't have to do anything to it. And hey, next, let's find something else. Or you can do that internally. So this is just sort of our sharing of what we're seeing. So I have a question here. How do you deal with the high turnover of staff with various admins and coordinators with the cost saving model 6? So suppose they have records coordinators and you train them and then they sort of turn over, Tom. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, that is a challenge, and that's probably the hardest part to your internal resources, is that on the one hand, you want to have a coordinator that has expertise in what the business is of your department. You don't want to bring in somebody who has expertise in IT to manage your finance records. You want somebody who knows the people, who knows everything that's going on. And so what we usually see organizations do is that they develop a succession plan, that the records manager, the person in charge of the program, the program manager will have a process for once they understand that someone is leaving, that someone is leaving the organization, they have a process to go out and have managers renominate somebody automatically. Now, that there are challenges with that as well, and I won't pretend that that's an easy thing to do, depending on how your departments and functions are resourced. But what we want to try to avoid, and what we've seen in a lot of organizations is, and what I think maybe this question maybe pointing at is, we see a lot of times where the coordinator leaves and nobody pays attention, and the manager doesn't realize that, oh, that person was the coordinator, I should let the program manager know. And the program manager is dealing with a lot of other things and doesn't realize it because they haven't heard from that coordinator. They may not know that they're gone. We want to try to avoid that situation. So it's really about developing a process for communicating the loss or the headcount reduction, and finding a way to eliminate it or to remediate it by bringing other people in.
And I guess the one thing I want to add to that is it's also how you position it. If the coordinator's job is to push everybody in their team to follow, manual records classification processes, which they don't want to do anyway, no. If you have a more modern program that really drives not only compliance, but really productivity and collaboration, that's a more exciting message. And by the way, the records compliance comes along with the ride. How you position your what type of program you have, if it really drives productivity and collaboration as well as governance, can make a big difference on getting people involved. Because if you're the records police, that's not fun for anybody. And it's not successful. So look at how you're running your program and how you're positioning it, what you're asking people to do. And again, we've helped our clients train, recruit and train coordinators, and we look for people that are enthusiastic, and we actually find a lot. It may sound crazy, but we do. All right, one more question. When we talk briefly about Contoral, most of you know us. We do a lot of things we talked about: assessmented roadmaps, policies, and schedules. We help with implementation. We have fractional records, information governance, and privacy people. And so if you want to talk about this, happy to do that. We have a virtual in-house seminar that we do a lot of these. If you want to get your team together and really have them talk about this, we do a seminar virtually just for your company or just for your organization. We talk about best practices. We can even offer CLE credit for the legal folks, although the audience is much larger than just the legal groups. It's virtual, it's easy, so we don't charge for it, but very, very popular. And it's a good way, we keep on talking about, hey, let's bring everybody together. So reach out to us at info@contoral.com. And it's not a sales pitch for us. And I'm happy to give you references. We do a fair amount of these, and it's easy for us to do. And likewise, if you use us to do a virtual seminar, you're not obligated to use us as consulting services. Hey, if that happens, that's great, but don't worry about that. Again, it's really easy for us to do. We also have peer exchanges that we've talked about in the past. If you want to meet with your peers in the same industry, we have those, and we have some of those coming up in the fall. So if you want to just, not us talking, we do enough talking, as you know, but rather us just sitting there and listening and talking to your peers, we offer a peer exchange on that. And then our next webinar, we're almost done with summer. Isn't that crazy? September 23rd, how do you define a record? That's the big debate. We're going to talk about exactly how you define a record. A bit niche, but oftentimes a big debate among a lot of different organizations. And as always, we have a tremendous amount of content. Happy to make that available. I'm going to see if I can hit this last question. Will this presentation materials be sent to registrants? We're going to make the recording available to this, and if you want this email, we don't as a by default email the registration materials, but if you want to email us, and just email us directly, and we'll be happy to, if that's something that you're interested in, we'll happy to be able to share it. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you for your questions. Do go for the post-webinar survey. We really look at those. And hey, you've just spent an hour of your time. Was it worthwhile? Did we provide any value or did not? Did we miss something that you really wanted? part of that is also, do you want to jump on the phone with us? And we're happy to walk through your specific pricing. You know, hey, Mark, what is this really going to cost us? Well, if we have a one-on-one conversation, happy to jump on for a few minutes to be able to do that, make that available. But do answer the survey, because we do look at that. And with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. And I just want to say thank you. And we wish you success as you go through this budgeting process. You know, it's the first step of a long journey, but you know, we wish you success, and we hope that's successful for you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.